next speaker is none other than Dr. Dorcas Chebet Juma. She is a senior lecturer in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Sewanee University. Dr. Juma, welcome.
Thank you very much. It is not easy to speak after Professor Esther Mombo, my lecturer and my mentor. But I know that through the grace of God, I'll be able to share what God has put in my heart. Before I present my thoughts, I want to share a testimony. Not long ago, we had a graduation ceremony, virtual, but graduates were given the opportunity to come and take photos in the university with their gowns. And something that caught my eyes was one student who was a he, she. And it seems that he has been keeping it underground for fear of his own life for some time when he was still a student. But when he graduated, he thought it is time, the way the first presenter said, it is time. And so he decided to show off as a way of celebrating. But unfortunately, Professor Mombo knows the stage of Kibaoni. The border people became very hostile towards him. And thanks to God, I was also going outside the gate. So fortunately, most of the border people at Kibaoni, they know me because I had a shop somewhere down there and they used to carry me. And I see a crowd gathered on somebody. Then I decided to penetrate the crowd. And when I penetrated the crowd, the student recognized me and said, Dr. Chebet. And when he said that, I went to him. And when the border people saw me going to him, they kept off. So I took him to my car and I decided to take him to his home to take him for safety. Of course, he did not allow me to reach with him at home, but at least he said, you have taken me to a place where I feel safe. Thank you very much. I will try to look for him, for her, so that I can try to share space with him, because I don't know where he is. And that informs my paper today. Voices from the margins matter to God. The motive, hermeneutical lens to the book of Jonah will be read for a post-COVID redemptive liberation theologies. I'll begin with the abstract I have for you. Our theme is the New World Order and Christianity in a New World Order. And I argue that the New World Order and Christianity in a global context should be understood from the context of neo-American white supremacy and neo-colonialism in Africa, in the name of universal salvation and a new Israel, a social order of oppression that denies God's people the right to live with dignity continues to thrive. Through social media and the mainstream media, some America's white supremacists continue to impose imperialism and white Christian supremacy over the minorities and the so-called other pagan nations. In the name of Christianity, America's white supremacy has created a pattern of globalization that fosters dominance over, fosters dominance and control over others, over the minorities and the world's weaker nations, with the conviction that without them, the world cannot be a better place. In this conversation, the motive hermeneutical lens to Jonah 1 will show that voices from the margins matter to God, and the words voices from the margins will be used with specific reference to the oppressed. In post-COVID-19 redemptive and liberation theologies, one will see that God mutes the marginalizing voice in order to elevate the voice of the marginalized. It is proposed that Christianity in the New World Order must, number one, identify the politics of control that camouflage into spirituality so as to be used as tools of oppression. Number two, use the space of the marginalized to elevate the faith and spiritualities of the marginalized. And three, confront the one who marginalizes with the right question. This way, Christianity in the New World Order will create a conducive environment that allows for the lives of all to flourish. The theology of liberation is a 1960s concept that emerged in the context of economic and political bondage of the poor people of African descent and women in general. While these groups of people were the majority, the few rich white men were very powerful. They controlled societal structures in such a way that there was a huge social gap between the rich and the poor. The main aim of liberation theology was to reconstruct the whole of Christian theology from the hermeneutical lens of the oppressor and the oppressed. Exodus chapter 3 verse 7 in particular, and the whole of chapter 3 in general, was very instrumental in championing for the liberation of the marginalized. In this text, number one, God sees the misery of the oppressed. Number two, God hears them crying out because of their oppressor. Number three, God is concerned about their suffering. Number four, God takes action by coming down from heaven to put mechanism of deliverance in place. Number five, God commands the oppressor to set God's people free. Thus, in liberation and redemptive theologies, number one, God is at the center stage. This is because all human beings are created in God's image and likeness and have the right to live with dignity. Number two, the oppressed identify with the oppressed characters in biblical narratives in order to tell their own stories from a liberating point of view. Number three, the oppressed does not suffer in silence. Number four, the narratives of liberation counter the narratives of the oppressor, creating a counter narrative that is pro-life. Notably, several years down the line, one would expect that it is now time for all of God's people to live a life of dignity as equally created in the image and likeness of God, according to Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. However, as technology has made it possible for the whole world to become a global village, the concept of liberation faces new challenges that call for dynamic and diverse approaches to unjust and oppressive systems across the world. All oppressions are interconnected. God is a God of justice, and justice is interconnected too. If justice is interconnected, redemption and liberation is not just connected, it is God's business. It is from this perspective that this paper seeks to use the motive hermeneutics to analyze Jonah 1 in particular and the book of Jonah in general. The main aim is to present a post-COVID redemptive and liberation theology that identifies and criticizes the politics of control and oppression that are well packaged in the name of Christianity and universal salvation. Arguably, spirituality is supposed to create fulfillment, safe space, and transform societal structures so that life can flourish. What is the motive hermeneutical lens to Jonah 1? The book of Jonah has been considered a missionary book by many scholars. It is categorized under the collection of minor prophets set within the reign of Jeroboam II. There is a general agreement that the book of Jonah was written after exile sometime between the late 5th to early 4th century BC. The book of Jonah is a narrative about Jonah, the son of Amittai, sent by God to prophesy the destruction of Nineveh. However, he tries to escape God's divine mission. Told from a missionary point of view, the book of Jonah has a long history of interpretation. In fact, it is a popular children's Sunday school story in many Afrocentric Christian settings. In Judaism, it is read during the afternoon of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, to instill a reflection on God's willingness to forgive those who repent. The book of Jonah remains a popular story in Christian context to date. Notably, the story is also retold in the Quran. Of particular interest to this paper and conversation in particular, not much has been done to show that the book of Jonah is largely a redemptive and liberation narrative that uses the space of the marginalized to elevate the God of the marginalized and the voices from the margins. In order to understand the book of Jonah from a redemptive and liberation point of view, the motive hermeneutical lens will be used to analyze the voices of the sailors and the nameless captain of the ship in Jonah chapter 1, verse 5 forward, in an upside down theology of interpretation that when used in a negative way will show that someone's real reasons for doing something are not necessarily the ones that they tell other people. Understood from the context of the narrator of the story of Jonah, for example, one would arguably say that the narrative was not entirely a mission-oriented narrative that was told to present the perspective of holistic salvation history. It is possible to argue that the book of Jonah was possibly written to show that the voices from the margins matter to God. Jonah is a narrative of liberation. Thus, redemption and liberation is God's primary business. In the motive hermeneutical lens to Jonah 1, the following questions are raised. Number 1, why did the city of Nineveh attract the attention of God? The English word Nineveh comes from Latin Nineveh and Septuagint Greek Ninawi, influenced by the biblical Hebrew Nineveh. The original meaning of the name is unclear. However, the Hebrew word is from the combination of the verb nun, which means to propagate or greatly increase, and the noun nawe, meaning abode, pasture, habitation, country, or area of residence. Nineveh was one of the oldest and greatest cities in antiquity. As an important junction for commercial routes crossing the Tigris on the Great Roadway between the Mediterranean Sea and the Indian Ocean, Nineveh united the East and the West while receiving wealth from many sources, just like America. She was one of the greatest of all regions of ancient cities and the last capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Could the economic prosperity of this place have informed the Hebrew name Nineveh or Nineveh? While this is not immediately clear from the text, it is worth noting that economic prosperity in most cases is also accompanied with oppression of the poor. That's according to Zechariah chapter 7, or if you read Zechariah chapter 7, verse 7 to 11. In fact, a number of Old Testament texts show that whenever Israel prospered economically, the minorities, aliens, orphans, poor, and the widows were oppressed. They were oppressed to the extent that they had no voice. In fact, that's why in Proverbs chapter 31, verse 1 to 9, the mother of King Lemuel tells him to be the voice of the voiceless. Violence and the shedding of innocent blood characterized Israel's economic prosperity. If you can see that in Jeremiah 22, verse 16 to 17. It seems that those who controlled the economy were able to make antiquous decrees and write oppressive statutes to stand aside the needy from the justice and to rob the poor of God's people of their rights. Isaiah 10, 1 to 3. They would lend money for interest and make excessive profits. Ezekiel 18, 13. Referred to as the people of the land, those who controlled the economy practiced extortion and committed robbery. They oppressed the poor and needy, extorting from the alien without redress. Ezekiel 22, verse 29. Is it possible that when the city of Nineveh greatly increased in habitation, oppression was the order of the day, a matter that caught the attention of God? After all, liberation and justice is God's business. Question number 2. When Jonah was running away from the Lord, he was headed for Tarshish. That is Jonah chapter 1, 1 to 3. He did not get the chance to reach his destination. The events informing the interpretation of the book of Jonah take place in the ship. The main characters are the God of the sailors, the God of the Hebrews, Jonah, the sailors, and the captain of the ship. The main stage is the middle of the sea, and the question is, why? Is this a reflection of the plight of immigrants? While the motive narrative approach informs the way the story of Jonah is presented to the readership, an agenda-setting theory also informs much of the media coverage when it comes to the plight of the marginalized and the immigrants sailing across the sea and ocean to Europe and America in search of socioeconomic deliverance and liberation. Notably, some media reports on the marginalized, refugees, and immigrants are positive, while others are negative, depending on the sources journalists use and the motive. Why? Now, question number 3, why does the narrative portray Jonah as having gone below the deck of the ship, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep? The prophet Jonah is coming from a Hebrew context where economic prosperity seems to be associated with oppression of the poor. He is being sent by God, the God of the Hebrews, to go to Nineveh and proclaim judgment upon the city for her unknown sins, possibly the oppression of the poor. Yet he is trying to hide from God. Was he also an oppressor in the Hebrew society? We do not know. However, there is general consensus among many scholars that oppression is interconnected and oppressors thrive when they maintain the status quo. Question number 4. Why did the nameless captain go to Jonah to confront him with the question, how can you sleep when we are about to perish? In context of suffering, it is important to gather courage and confront your fears. You do this by gathering the courage to direct your question to the right person. In most cases, oppressors socialize their victims to be passive recipients of injustices by socializing them to, number 1, play the victim, praise the oppressor because of the fear of the power of the oppressor. Number 3, watch from a distance. Number 4, become accomplices. Number 5, become numb to the pain and assist the oppressor to maintain the status quo by normalizing oppression. Question number 5. Why did the captain challenge Jonah to get up and call on his God? Maybe he will take notice and spare them. Was the God of Jonah silent to the suffering of the sailors? The point here is that number 1, the narrator wants to clearly show that the sailors and the captain of the ship are foreigners, while number 2, the narrative do a contrast between the narrator and the narrative. The narrative portrays the sailors and the captain as pious in contrast to the reluctant prophet Jonah. If one applies the motive hermeneutics here, it is possible to say that the God of Jonah silenced the voice of Jonah so as to elevate the voices of the sailors in the space of the sailors. After all, it was Jonah who was a foreigner in the space of the sailors. Question number 6. Why did the sailors say to each other, "Come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity"? And when they did cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah, the practice, and when they did cast lots, the lots fell on Jonah. The practice of casting lots to find a guilty person is common in the Hebrew Bible. In 1 Samuel 14, verse 42, for example, the casting of lots is used to find out the person who broke the oath that Saul made, while in Jonah chapter 18, verse 6, a guilty party is found by lot. While the casting lots is important in this narrative, of great interest to this conversation is the fact that the sailors discuss among themselves to find ways of deliverance from the imminent calamity. In redemptive and liberation theologies, dialogue among the voices from the margins is very important. It is important for the oppressed to ask the right questions amongst themselves to determine environments that allow oppression to flourish. Question number 7. Why did the sailors ask Jonah, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? Notably, the sailors had already said to each other, "Come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity." They cast lots and the lot fell on Jonah. The question, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us, creates a conversational platform that allows the sailors to directly link Jonah to the possibility of a socio-economic aspect of life that can possibly link him to oppression of the poor. The series of the question include, what kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? And so on. Is it possible that the acts of oppression against God's people in a country can make God to hold an individual responsible too? In the African societal setting, the crimes of an individual can cause the whole community to suffer the wrath of God, and the crimes of the community can also cause God to punish an individual. Hence the famous African Ubuntu philosophy, I am because you are, and because you are, therefore we are. This explains why Jonah was asked by the sailors, "From what people are you?" In other words, in redemptive and liberation theologies, it is important to contextualize oppression. Thus, the motive hermeneutical lens to Jonah has shown that in the space of the sailors, the voices of the sailors created a conversational platform that allowed for the sailors to be delivered from the fear of death and to be liberated from the selfish motive of Jonah. The words, "Come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity," can as well be turned into an upside down hermeneutics to form a question, who is responsible for this? It is by confronting the oppressor with the right question that a platform for a question conversational mode is activated. So they asked him, the sailors, Tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you? While it is not clear from the narrative if the sailors were a minority or were oppressed, it is worth noting how the narrator shifts the focus from the God of the sailors to the God of the Hebrews. Does it mean that the God of the sailors is not the God of the Hebrews? Asked from the redemptive and liberation point of view, one would say, is the God of the oppressor the God of the oppressed? Voices from the margins matter to God. In the discussion above, we have seen how the motive hermeneutical lens to the book of Jonah has shown that the voices from the margins matter to God. This discussion elevates the voices of the sailors as voices from the margins. In the voices of the sailors, God is making some bold countercultural narratives about the marginalized. The voices of the victims of neo-white supremacies and neo-colonialism matter to God. The voices of the people of African descent, women, and LGBTIQAs matter to God. When the voices from the margins confront the oppressor with the right questions, the spaces of the marginalized are transformed into meaningful, action-oriented platforms. Thus, post-COVID redemptive and liberation theologies identify Thus, post-COVID-19 redemptive and liberation theologies identifies with the voices of the sailors who find voice against insurmountable cultural odds to challenge a systemic tool of control packaged as a religious order, the God of the Hebrews. It is from this perspective that one would arguably say that the New World Order should present Christianity in ways that allows for all of God's people to breathe. In the New World Order, Christianity should be packaged in such a way that the laws of social and cultural gravity are redefined from the margins to the mainstream. The hashtag is the voices from the margins matter. In conclusion, the post-COVID redemptive and liberation theologies is an affirmative theological approach. From the motive hermeneutical lens to Jonah 1, one sees that it is possible to express your spirituality from the other side while sailing from the same boat. In order for all of God's people to live a life of dignity as equally created in the image of God, it is important to resist traditional ways of addressing problematic issues by doing things in a new way. That means interpreting the book of Jonah 1 from a liberating point of view reaffirms the possibility of demolishing the center in order to redraw the parameters of biblical interpretation. This way, it is possible to offer alternative biblical interpretation that are pro-life. The suffering of the marginalized is God's business. Hence, the New World Order should present Christianity in such a way that life-threatening issues are confronted with the right questions while the issues are still relevant. This can be done by identifying hierarchies of oppression, creating and upholding safe space. Thank you.
Again, wow. Absolutely amazing presentation. Thank you so much. And I know that's not easy to present in front of current and former professors and mentors, but you did a great job. Thank you so much, Dr. Chebet. I wanted to, a question kept coming to me when you were sharing about And I loved that notion of kind of who is the margin, like where is the margin actually, and what voices are we centering, and why? And what came to mind was two things. One is that fact that we are all have and have nots, right? Like I think a lot of times those who are oppressed don't always necessarily see the power that also we hold, and oppressors lose out when not seeing their areas of great need. And the thought that came to mind was, I was thinking about my kind of fantasy thoughts of, okay, everybody's gonna buy what you just talked about and what each one of our speakers today talked about, and we're gonna go into this liberative way of living. How do we protect ourselves when thinking of that journey from recreating what we just liberated ourselves from? What does that, what might that look like, right? Because at any given point in time, once the new structure is established, how do we help to ensure that what is created, what we go toward, does not become oppressive in and of itself? If that question makes sense.
Actually, it makes sense, a lot of sense, in a way that it opens up a platform for conversation. Just the way I tried to interpret the book of Jonah in a new way. Yeah. You are actually using a motive hermeneutical lens to the presentation. Mm-hmm. And maybe I can say the word voices from the margins is also a social construction, just the way oppression is a social construction, mm-hmm. to create possibilities of offering the voiceless an opportunity to find voice and offer a counter narrative. Mm-hmm. So it is actually a political term. And you know, in theologies of liberation, you must actually be biased, because you are seeking an opportunity to find voice from the context of your own experiences.
Mm-hmm. When thinking about these conversations we're having right now, when I look at the varied parts of the world that our speakers and participants are from, inherently, there is a tension that gets created for the very purpose you just talked about. So how do we hold those conversations even in ways that help to ensure the kind of integrity that we would want to bring, whether we're speaking theologically and socially, economically, like how do you even hold those conversations with integrity, with people coming in from so many varied vantage points, all of us saying, yes, I'm vested in liberation theology, yay, liberation theology, I'm in, I drank the Kool-Aid, okay? And then we're gonna go and all come together and have a conversation. How does that happen with integrity based on your presentation?
Actually, one of the things that is holding us back is that fear of finding the correct, the orthodox, the integrity. And we are delaying so much, and it is continuing to create fear. There is no formula. There is no formula. The most important thing is to create a platform that allows for conversations to take place. It doesn't matter how, there is no formula.
Yeah.
And you know, again, we wait for the moment, the way the first speaker said. And let me tell you, people have waited for the moment and they are still waiting.
Yes, yes. And I think there are so many more of us now who are ready to take that step. I was thinking, Genesis was referenced a little earlier, and I was just thinking about this notion of, in Genesis 1, of the Spirit of God hovering over the earth, hovering over creation. And really the interpretation of that word is God hovering over chaos, right? And in this way that a mother hen might hover over an egg. And what's interesting is that in order for that to work, we must disrupt, you know, the whole process of hovering over chaos. Yes. Is disruptive in and of itself. And that's never comfortable, and that's not always neat and tidy, to your point. There is no map for that. I love something that Bishop Yvette Flunder with the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries stated. And what she said was, there is no roadmap for where we're going, but we're not lost.
In fact, when you talk about the creation and the Spirit of God hovering, the point here is the voice. If God did not speak, so it all started by God speaking, let there be.
Yes, yes.
Love it. It is the voice. The formula is not there, but the power is in the voice. Speak.
Yes, thank you so much. And be courageous while speaking. Every speaker has referenced that, right? The courage needs
with
to
the
do that.
Power of God.
Yes. Thank you so very much. What an amazing presentation.